Oh, God, I've lost my wife. Am I slowly losing all three of my children too? Andrew whispered, the wine glass trembling in his hand in the cold, empty mansion. Where laughter had faded for years, the triplets lived under a heavy silence. Emma, Ethan, and Evan, each burdened with a congenital illness, lost their mother the very day they were born. Their father, Andrew, a millionaire broken by grief, believed nothing could ever reach his children again. Then, one day, a simple woman with no fame walked in. With just a jazz melody, a sudden dance in the kitchen, she rekindled something both the mansion and the father thought had been lost forever. But what if that was only the beginning? Join us to discover how healing can come from the most unexpected places. Before we begin the main story, do you believe that love can still speak even when words fail? The silver tray clattered onto the marble floor, the metallic echo ringing down the long hallway like a warning bell. A small figure staggered, crouched down, and with trembling hands gathered each spoon that had scattered. Elena Brooks, the eighth maid in a single month, let out a sigh that broke into a faint laugh. It wasn't joy, it was simply her way of reminding herself that at least she hadn't fled yet, unlike the 7 before her. 2 weeks had passed since she stepped into the Hale mansion, a place where every door stayed shut, heavy drapes smothered the light, and laughter had never been heard. The triplets, Emma, Ethan, and Evan, only 3 years old, had already become quiet shadows within their own home. People often said children were the sound that never ceased, yet here, silence pressed down until it suffocated. They sat side by side, 3 small chairs, in a straight line like tiny soldiers. Emma stared at a blank spot on the ceiling, her gaze lost in a world of her own. Ethan held a wooden block in his hand but never moved, as though time itself had frozen. Evan, the most restless of the 3, tapped his fingers lightly on the table, steady as the beat of an invisible clock. No cries, no demands, no outstretched hands reaching for anything. They were present, and yet it was as if they had already faded. Andrew Hale, their father, a widowed millionaire, rarely appeared. When he did, he drifted past like a ghost in expensive suits, leaving behind the scent of coffee and cigarette smoke, and eyes always red behind his glasses. For him, every treatment trial had ended in failure. And for the maids, every attempt at comfort ended with 2 words: dismissal. Elena knew she was just another link in that endless chain. But unlike the others, she was not afraid of silence. Growing up in a large family of siblings, she had learned that not every child spoke with words. Some used their eyes, some used movement. The only question was, would anyone have the patience to listen? One bleak afternoon, gray clouds draped over the mansion like a heavy blanket. Elena opened her bag, pulled out an old Bluetooth speaker with chipped plastic edges, and set it down on the long wooden table. Her finger hovered for a moment before pressing play. Jazz spilled out of place within walls that had only echoed footsteps for years. The first bass note made Elena fear she would be fired on the spot. But then, something strange happened. Emma tilted her head, brown hair falling across her shoulder, her eyes wider than usual, as if hearing a secret. Evan, the finger tapper, suddenly changed rhythm to match the drums. And Ethan, the quietest of all, let out a soft laugh. Just a fragile sound, yet it rang like a bell through an abandoned cathedral. Elena held her breath, heart pounding. She didn't dare shatter the moment with words. Instead, she opened her arms gently, let the music guide her body, and began to turn. The first step was clumsy. She almost tripped over a chair, and she broke into a quick laugh at herself. A small, unplanned humor, but somehow, it eased the heavy air. The 3 children hesitantly stood. Emma stepped first, her tiny feet tapping the wooden floor in rhythm with the song. Evan followed, cautious but curious. Then Ethan, after a sidelong glance as if asking permission, stepped forward too. Their movements were awkward, stiff, but something had stirred to life in each sway. The cold kitchen became an unexpected stage. Three small figures swayed around Elena, their clumsy dance filled with life. Music blended with the sound of feet against wood, proclaiming, "We are still here. We can still laugh. We can still dance." At the end of the hallway, a figure appeared. Andrew Hale stood frozen in the doorway, cold coffee in hand. His chest tightened, heart twisting as he watched his children move not from medication side effects, but from joy. He didn't step in, only stood there, his eyes unbelieving at the sight before him. For the first time in years, the lifeless house seemed to breathe. A small smile, fragile but powerful enough to shake the mansion sealed in silence for 3 years. But was it only a fleeting moment, or the beginning of something that could change everything? So then, my dear audience, if you're watching and this story has moved you, comment the number 1 or type, "I'm still here to continue listening." I once thought this mansion would always remain silent, but in the days that followed, laughter began to creep into every corner. Dinner was no longer just the cold clash of cutlery against plates. Now Emma smiled when I poured her milk, Ethan clapped along to the music from the old speaker, and Evan sometimes let out a strange sound, like an unfinished note. Small as they were, to me they felt like a choir. And yet, instead of relief, I felt as though I were standing outside a glass door, peering through the fog. Elena stood at the center of that circle, while I, their father, was nothing more than a shadow adrift. At times, I tried to join in, offering a spoonful of food, but the children turned toward Elena, reaching for her hand as if she were the only source they could trust. A part of me wanted to laugh at the irony, but the rest of me tightened with bitterness. I decided to share this fragile joy with the family's longtime doctor. I wanted his acknowledgement, needed someone to tell me I wasn't imagining it. The clinic was as bright and sterile as always, the acrid scent of disinfectant clinging to my suit collar. I spoke of the kitchen dance, the hesitant laughter. The moment Emma's hand brushed my cheek, I waited for a nod, but he only raised his brows, his eyes icy behind metal frames. "That's just a random reaction. Don't foster false hope." The words struck me like a hammer. I forced a smile, nodded, played the part of a chastised student, but inside a storm surged. Random? Then what of everything I had seen in my children's eyes? Was it all some cruel trick of fate? And Elena was all that she had done, nothing but an illusion? On the drive back, drizzle speckled the windshield, the wipers dragging streaks across the glass like my fractured thoughts. I remembered Emma clutching tightly at Elena's leg, Ethan's eyes lighting up when she turned on the music, Evan's curious tilt of the head when she laughed. I began to envy her presence. Not only because my children trusted her, but because perhaps I trusted her too. That night, I poured a heavy glass of wine and sat in the dark library. Sarah's photograph rested on the desk, her gentle eyes filled with reproach. I had once promised to protect the children for us both. Yet here was a stranger doing it better than I ever could. I wondered, had Sarah sent Elena in her place, or was fate mocking me once again? For a moment, I wanted to step into the children's room, to sit beside Elena, to try just once to show the kids I too could make them feel safe. But my legs refused to move. I feared their eyes would slip past me, seeking her instead. I leaned back in the chair, the sound of giggles spilling from the hallway, sweet and merciless at once. Inside, my 3 children were coming alive again, while I remained a wanderer at the edge of my own home. As joy rekindled within these walls, I began to wonder, was I slowly losing my role as their father, or was Elena becoming their true mother? One light rainy afternoon, as the skylight cast a dim glow over the dust-covered attic, Elena accidentally stumbled upon an old wooden box hidden among forgotten suitcases. The lid popped open, revealing a stack of yellowed photographs in dusty frames. On top lay a picture of Sarah Andrews' late wife, smiling brightly in a summer floral dress. The moment seemed to thicken the air, as if time itself had stopped. Elena froze, brushing away a thin layer of dust, as though awakening a sleeping memory. Beneath the photo lay a hastily folded note, a few old concert tickets, even a pair of worn dance shoes with frayed heels. Everything spoke of a woman who had once loved music, who had once turned this cold living room into a stage for love and family. Elena carried the frame downstairs and placed it at the center of the long wooden table. Then she played Sarah's favorite tune, a Latin dance melody, vibrant yet tender. Emma noticed first. The little girl hesitated, then inched closer, her tiny finger resting against the glass, as if reaching for warmth from the photograph. Slowly, her small hands formed the sign for Mama. Ethan, almost instinctively, copied the gesture. Evan burst into a giggle, the clear sound echoing through the vast living room. Andrew stepped in from the hallway, stopping short at the sight. His hand trembled, the cup tilted, spilling drops of coffee onto the carpet he didn't even notice. Tears welled and slid down a face long practiced at hiding emotion. In that moment, he was forced to admit Sarah was still here. Through memory, through music, and now through the tiny hands of their children. Slowly, Andrew raised his hand, his fingers fumbling as he formed the sign for Papa. Clumsy, but utterly sincere. The three children looked at him, eyes wide, then suddenly laughed together and rushed to embrace him. His chest felt as if it would burst. The long estrangement melted away. The atmosphere in the mansion shifted instantly. Wooden walls seemed less cold, the golden lamps burned brighter than usual. Elena smiled quietly and stepped back, giving father and children their rare moment. Yet inside her, something ached, as if she had brushed against a scar not fully healed. That night, Andrew did not sleep in the library as he always did. Instead, he spread blankets in the living room, laying down beside the triplets, listening to the music Sarah once loved. For the first time, the house did not feel empty. On the contrary, it pulsed with both past and present, blending into a new rhythm of life. The next morning, Andrew brewed coffee, softly humming the tune from the photograph. He suddenly remembered how Sarah had once taught him to dance, how she had teased him when he stepped on her feet. A fleeting smile crossed his lips, part sheepish, part tender. A thought sparked in his mind. Perhaps it was time to let music return to this mansion, not only as memory, but as a living flame. But behind that fragile joy, a shadow lurked. While tidying the medicine cabinet in the hallway, Elena noticed something unsettling on the labels. A strange, acrid smell, misprinted symbols, irregular dosages. She shivered briefly, then pushed the thought aside. The mansion was no longer a prison of silence, but a place where past and present touched. Yet was this revival strong enough to withstand the darkness hiding in those bottles of medicine? A memory awakened, a family reunited. But behind the joy, was there a deeper truth, one more dangerous than any pain they had ever known? Late at night, as the clock struck 12, the Hale mansion stood as silent as an abandoned cathedral. On the third floor, the nursery door sat ajar. Inside, the steady breathing of three sleeping triplets echoed after a long day of dancing with Elena. But in the hallway, the dim glow of a table lamp cast Elena's shadow on the wall, stretched long and haunting. She wasn't asleep. In her heart, a strange puzzle piece was making the picture of peace feel broken. She had begun to notice from the smallest details. Every time Andrew carefully gave the children their prescribed medicine, hours later, Emma's spark would fade, Ethan no longer clapped, and Evan sat still like a doll. Yet on days when the dose was forgotten or delayed, the children grew unusually lively, laughing and dancing more than ever. The contrast was too stark to ignore. One evening, after Andrew had fallen asleep in the library, she tiptoed into the small medical room at the end of the hallway. The metal drawers were icy cold, releasing a sharp chemical stench that made her grimace. On the shelves, bottles of medicine stood neatly in line, labels crisp, but the closer she looked, the more uneasy she felt. The print was blurred, batch numbers missing familiar codes. Worst of all, no FDA certification seal. Elena picked up a bottle and gave it a light shake. The liquid inside was thick, cloudier than it should have been. A shiver ran down her spine. She had once volunteered at a community health clinic, and she knew legitimate medicine was never labeled so carelessly. She set the bottle down, pulled out her phone, switched it to silent, and began snapping pictures. Each faint click echoed in the stillness, making her spin around as if someone stood right behind her. But the hallway was empty. She didn't stop there. Elena slid open the file cabinet. Inside lay the children's medical records. Flipping quickly through, her eyes scanned the numbers. The same medication, prescribed over and over at double or triple the normal dose. The invoices stacked high, at prices 3 times above market. Sweat broke across her forehead. This was no mistake, it was a deliberate scheme for profit. Her hands shook as she scribbled notes. Every number, every doctor's signature pierced her like a knife. The man Andrew had trusted for years, paid hundreds of thousands annually for special care, might be the very one turning the triplets into victims. Elena closed the file, shoved her phone into her pocket, and tried to quiet the thunder of her heartbeat. Turning away, she caught her reflection in a hallway mirror, blurred, pale with fear. A thought struck her. If she had seen this, surely someone would want her silenced. Descending the stairs, she bumped against a wooden bench, the creak sharp as a gunshot in the midnight stillness. She froze, breath held. From the library, the warm yellow light flickered. Andrew stirred, but did not wake. Relieved, she crept down to the kitchen and hid her phone in a private drawer. Sitting alone in the dark, Elena hugged her arms tight, feeling as though she had just opened a door that could never be closed. The fragile joy she and the children had built now trembled, threatened by a far greater scheme. If those bottles weren't medicine at all, but a trap? Could Elena stay silent to preserve this fragile peace, or would she risk everything to expose the truth and ignite the coming storm? Are you still here, my dear audience? Take a pause, relax for a moment, maybe grab a glass of water before we dive into the next part of this gripping story. If you find it intriguing, comment 1 below, and don't forget to hit subscribe before we continue to the most thrilling part. The cold white light of the clinic reflected off sterile walls, making Andrew feel as though he had stepped onto a stage in a play where he no longer belonged. The sharp tang of disinfectant clung to his suit collar, a harsh reminder of the years he had placed blind trust in this very room. At the desk, the doctor adjusted his tie, his indifferent eyes behind round metal frames familiar, yet suddenly distant and unbearably cold. Andrew spoke, his voice laced with both nervousness and pride about the children's changes. The first smile, the sudden laughter at dinner, the tentative steps to music. But the more he spoke, the more he noticed the doctor's face stiffen. The man's brows drew together, as though Andrew were wasting his time. "You don't understand anything," the doctor snapped, his bitter voice echoing across the room. "You pay me to control them. Without me, those 3 children will fall silent forever." The words pierced Andrew's chest like a blade. He froze, anger and fear colliding inside him like an undertow. This was the man who had walked with his family through more than a decade of grief after Sarah's death. The man he had called at midnight whenever a fever struck, now looking at him as nothing more than an easy fool to exploit. The door swung open softly. Elena appeared, silent, holding out her phone. On the screen glowed damning emails, correspondence between the doctor and a pharmaceutical company. Lines of cold numbers, thousands of dollars in kickbacks for every fraudulent prescription. The electronic signature at the bottom shone like a seal of guilt. Andrew stared at the screen, then at the man before him. His face drained of color, lips dry. Every memory of trust, every ounce of faith he had once placed in this man crumbled like a sandcastle under the tide. He remembered nights rushing the children to the ER, the reassuring hand on his shoulder, the endless invoices he signed without hesitation. And now he saw it clearly, all of it had been for profit, turning his triplets into pawns in a darker game of medicine. Rage surged, tangled with humiliation. Andrew, the man who had always controlled everything, his company, his fortune, his reputation, had let another man manipulate the very heart of his family. Elena stood firm, her eyes tense but unwavering. Her hand gripped the phone tightly, as if offering Andrew one final chance to choose: remain silent in shame, or face the brutal truth head on. The moment stretched endlessly. Outside, a distant car horn reminded him the world was still moving, while here, the lives of his children dangled by a fragile thread. Andrew drew a long breath, his gaze slowly locking on the doctor. His eyes were no longer wet with grief, but cold, sharp-seeing. Perhaps for the first time in over a decade, the man's true face. The clinic fell silent. Even the tick of the clock seemed to stop. In Andrew's mind, only one thought echoed. The man he had once believed a savior had, in truth, been feeding off his family's pain. And in that instant of betrayal, as years of trust shattered in a heartbeat, the question loomed: would Andrew endure the charade to preserve the illusion, or would he rise to confront it, no matter the devastating cost? On the morning the trial opened, the doors of the federal courthouse were no longer just the gateway to law. They became a stage where truths buried for years would finally be dragged into the light. Dozens of reporters jostled for space, cameras flashing, the strobe of light slicing across Andrew's face like cold blades. On the front page of every paper, bold headlines screamed, "Fake prescription scandal, a drug fraud that shook the nation." The courtroom was packed, not a seat left empty. Jurors sat in rows, their eyes solemn. Behind them, the gallery buzzed with whispers, punctuated by the furious scribbling of journalists' pens. In the middle of this heavy atmosphere, Andrew sat beside Elena. He still wore his familiar dark suit, but his hand trembled on his knee, carrying the weight of an entire family. Elena was called first. She stood small in stature, but her gaze unyielding. Before the court, she recounted nights when the triplets curled on their beds, drenched in sweat after every dose. She described the ragged breaths, the vacant eyes, the suffocating silence that haunted a house already too silent. She presented photos, scans of records with misprinted labels and inflated invoices. Each word struck like a blade, cutting deep into the wall of deceit. The room held its breath, broken only by the judge's gavel reminding all to keep order. When his turn came, Andrew rose. His voice broke, yet his words were firm. He spoke of the first time his children laughed, how precious that smile had been, and how close the pills had come to stealing even that fragile light. "Money can't save my children," he said softly, eyes blurred with tears. "But truth can." The jurors sat in silence. Some lowered their heads as if to avoid the weight of his gaze, but in their eyes flickered a spark of compassion. At the defense table, the once respected doctor sat rigid, face flushed, hands clenched tight. Emails were spread before him, the lines of kickbacks undeniable, his electronic signature a brand of guilt. The pharmaceutical company's representatives scrambled to defend themselves, claiming it was an individual's mistake, that they had no knowledge. But contract after contract read aloud pressed them deeper against the wall. At last the verdict came. The doctor was stripped of his license permanently and faced a suspended prison sentence. The pharmaceutical firm was ordered to pay millions in damages, a sum that rattled the entire industry. Reporters poured out, racing to write explosive headlines. But for Andrew, the verdict wasn't in numbers. He turned toward the gallery, where his triplets sat in the arms of a temporary caretaker, their eyes bright. 3 innocent smiles. That was the true victory. As court adjourned, Andrew stepped outside. The harsh sunlight poured down, piercing through the cloud that had cloaked his family for years. Elena walked beside him, silent, but her hand brushed his, just a fleeting touch, yet enough to remind him they had brought truth into the open together. Justice had been served. But was this new light strong enough to hold the happiness they had reclaimed, or was another trial still waiting just ahead? Spring light poured over the Hale estate garden, no longer shadowed as in the years before. For the first time, the land once left to weeds now rang with the bright laughter of 3 children. Elena brought out a bag of seeds, each small packet stamped with colorful flowers. She spread them across her palm, and 3 small faces leaned close, their eyes glowing as though they had discovered treasure. Emma carefully picked up each seed, placing it gently into the damp earth, her tiny hands smudged with dirt but her gaze radiant with joy. Ethan worked eagerly with a toy spade, digging little holes so fast that soil sometimes sprayed onto his own face, making him laugh aloud. Evan, usually the quietest, proved the most meticulous, covering each seed and patting the soil softly, as if afraid of hurting the sprout yet to bloom. Elena sat among them, dust in her hair, her smile shining brighter than ever. Andrew knelt beside them, his hands once only used to sign contracts now dirt-stained and raw. He had thought himself incapable of planting again, convinced that everything in life could vanish as Sarah had. But when Emma's small hand touched his, when Evan's eyes lifted toward him in a smile, he understood. Planting was not just hope, but a promise to stay, no matter what. They named the new garden Grace. The name came from the children themselves, a tribute to the mother who was gone but never truly absent. The following month, the first day of school arrived. The courtyard bustled with children, backpacks bright with color. Emma, Ethan, and Evan walked along the brick path, backpacks swaying with each step, their hands tightly clasped in those of their father and Elena. Near the school gates, Andrew faltered. He had never imagined such a simple moment could make his heart tremble so deeply. Elena smiled in reassurance, and together, the 4 of them stepped inside. A local photographer captured that instant. A family of 4 standing before the school gates, sunlight slanting through the trees, turning everything into a luminous painting. The photo later appeared in the news not only for the scandalous trial behind them, but for the rare image of healing in a world too full of hurt. That evening, the living room was no longer adorned with soulless paintings by famous artists. Instead, Andrew chose a simple wooden frame and placed the schoolyard photograph in the center of the Great Wall. Beside it hung Sarah's old photo. 2 pictures, 2 moments, but standing together like a single flowing current, an imperfect family, yet one that truly belonged to each other. Elena gazed at the frame, her hand gently resting on Andrew's shoulder. He nodded. No words needed. The children's laughter echoed from the hallway, not fragile or fleeting this time, but strong and rhythmic, heralding a new chapter. Inside each of them, they knew. Justice had been served, pain had been named, and the future, though full of challenges, had opened into light. It had all begun with a dance in a silent kitchen, and now ended with a photograph reminding them that family can be reborn from ashes. Spring closed with a new family photograph hanging on the wall of the Hale mansion. In that frame, past and present blended into one, bearing the name Grace. The 3 children who once lived in silence now laughed freely. Andrew, once consumed by loneliness, had found his faith again, and Elena, the ordinary woman, had become the bridge that bound them all together. But the story is not truly over. In a world where profit too often outweighs conscience, who can say that the shadows have vanished completely? The emails, the contracts already exposed, were only fragments of a larger picture. Beyond the courtroom doors, how many more secrets still wait to be uncovered? And when the first flowers bloom in the Grace Garden, will the Hale family have the strength to protect the fragile peace they have just reclaimed? The lesson of this journey is clear. Truth holds the power to heal, and love, fragile though it may be, is strong enough to stand against the dark. Sometimes, victory is not measured by verdicts or financial settlements, but by the smile returning to a child's face. That is the true treasure, and the reminder to us all that happiness cannot be bought, but it can be planted, with faith, with patience, and with the courage to speak the truth. If this story has touched you, share it with your friends and family in the United States. Perhaps someone who needs hope will find strength in it. And don't forget to leave a comment below. What do you think of Andrew and Elena's choices? Is the Hale family truly safe, or is another trial quietly waiting ahead? Let us know where you're watching from and at what time. And if you'd like to see part 2 of this story, where the unspoken secrets will slowly come to light, make sure to hit subscribe so you won't miss what comes next.